and starting now is a panel of authors talking about the Trump administration. It's Joshua Green, Katie Tur of NBC, and investigative journalist David Cay Johnston. Now, after this panel concludes, David Cay Johnston will be joining us to take your calls. You're watching Book TV on C-SPAN 2, live coverage from Tucson.
The ship is about to sail.
You should tweet a picture of the audience.
And you are on board. Get that? Yeah.
I just muted.
The high sound. Brothers and sisters, welcome to the best panel at the Tucson Festival of Books. And my name is John Nichols. I write for The Nation magazine. I wrote a book about Donald Trump and the people around him called Horsemen of the Trumpocalypse. We're not going to talk about my book. We're going to talk about some other ones here. I got to go through some bureaucracy at the start because we're on C-SPAN, which you may applaud because C-SPAN is a very good thing for books. I'm getting old enough to read these things without my glasses. And we want to thank the Research Corporation for Science Advancement and Cade Industries, Andy and Stuart Shatkin, who are right here in the front row, and they have helped to sponsor this particular event. We are delighted to be with them. I know that every one of you have already purchased copies of the books that we are talking about today, but you will want to purchase a second one outside when the authors go to the book tent, and most of you know where that is. I think that is the guts of what we have to tell you up front, except it says very short intros. Authors don't like long introductions on the instructions here. That surprises me. But for those of you who know me and know the stuff I've written about, you know that I'm a structuralist. I am very, very concerned about the structures of our economy, our democracy, our society. And I think they usually tell us more about where we're going than a personality-driven, individual-focused journalism or politics, right? I think structures matter more than individuals, except when we're talking about Donald Trump. Because Donald Trump, and this is just the truth of it, Donald Trump has shown us, no matter what you think about the guy, the strengths and vulnerabilities of the American political process. His presidency is different than any before it, and the big question is it the beginning of something else, or is it an anomaly? We'll find that out today because we have literally the smartest Trump watchers in the country with us. And at this point, when you're not mumbling to each other and checking your phones and stuff like that, you're really focused. So I'm going to ask them the core question up front. We'll start with Katie Tur. And by the way, not to insult the guys on the panel, but everyone I talked to outside said, "Is this the Katie Tur panel?"
Thank you.
Katie has written an incredible book, unbelievable. I read the book, and I've taught a little bit of journalism in my life, and I will tell you flat out that as interesting as it is regards Donald Trump, it is a textbook for young people coming into journalism today. It really tells you the reality because Katie opens up and is very, very honest about how annoying and painful and difficult it can be, but also how exhilarating and exciting. Yeah. Katie's going to answer our first question here, and then we'll ask the others as well. What is it for these folks, and we're going to go into a lot more stuff here, but what is it, the one thing that you really want these people to know after a year and a half or 2 years of following Donald Trump?
Has it been I think it's been 3 years.
Yeah, I know,
gosh, yeah, it doesn't feel like 100.
Count when you're having fun.
Yeah, we're running up on 3 years. As if I don't know how to use one of these things. Thank you very much, sir. I think we're close to 3 years covering Donald Trump. The one thing that people don't understand about him or don't want to understand about him is the simplest thing. Donald Trump is not complicated. He's not a complicated person. And when you're watching television or you're reading newspapers or you're reading analysis or opinion pieces or you're talking to your friends and everyone's trying to figure out why he's doing a certain thing or saying a certain thing, it's a very simple answer. He's saying it because he wants to figure out, or he's promoting himself, essentially. How does this one thing affect Donald Trump? Not how does this one thing affect the economy or the auto industry or foreign policy or equality. It's all in relation to how it affects Donald Trump. It's a zero-sum game. Is it good for Donald Trump individually and for his business? Is it not good for Donald Trump? And so if you look at things going forward through that lens, he'll be much easier to understand.
Katie Tur. And by the way, one other quick little follow-up on that. On the day that you're the one on his mind, or the 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 days, he talks about you very bluntly. And should we think of that as an accomplishment or a failure? Or what is that?
It's a
as
mix.
it's standing there in the crowd.
It's a mixed honor. Some people will say that's the greatest honor to have Donald Trump insult you.
In front of 10,000 people.
However many people it is. Listen, I think if he's on your radar because you've done something he does not like, it's not a bad thing, I guess, because he often doesn't like the truth. And if you're telling the truth and he calls you out for telling the truth, I mean, thank you for confirming that I'm telling the truth. Basically.
Katie Tur. Joshua Green. By the way, I should mention that Katie Tur, well, before we get to Joshua, because he's a rockin' good guy, but because it's, you know, is this the Katie Tur
No.
panel? No, but before, everybody knows that Katie did such a good job covering the campaign that they gave her a show on MSNBC, and now it is highly rated and an incredibly successful show, because we should tell your affiliation
Thank you.
as well.
2 p.m. MSNBC, East Coast time. I believe that is noon here in Arizona. Correct me if I'm wrong. And you should watch
Guys.
Daylight Savings Time.
Arizona has multiple times. It's
Okay,
you're in
you
another
figure it out.
place.
It's 2 p.m. in the East, and then you figure out. And 5 p.m. for Meet the Press Daily every Monday. Anyway, Josh.
Joshua Green, the author of Devil's Bargain. Now, yeah. I think he won the cover contest. Because this is a very, we were just saying before, this is kind of a little bit of a Netflix kind of poster thing going on here with Donald Trump and Steve Bannon. Joshua he has worked for The Atlantic. He's a Bloomberg writer. He's on CNN a great deal. You've seen him all over the place. The thing about this book that is so significant is it isn't just about Trump. It's about a lot more going on around him. But again, we're going to begin with that core question. What's the one thing you want these people to keep with them through this whole journey?
Sure. Well, first of all, is my mic working okay for everybody? Good, good. Okay, all right. Real quick, by the way, my mother also calls it the Katie Tur panel. Oh, honey, I saw the thing you did on the Katie Tur panel. So it's even in my own family, I'm getting second billing. But that's okay. I think it was Katie Tur panel. So the one takeaway I think that I learned writing the book and kind of thinking about, my book essentially tells the story of how Steve Bannon and Donald Trump came together and triumphed in a way that even those of us, or at least me, who had front row access to it, didn't see happening in real time. I didn't think that Donald Trump was going to win until about 10 p.m. on election night, and then it hit me like a thunderbolt, and oh my God.
So that would make you an American.
That would make me an American, yeah. I think in reassessing all that happened, what's most important to know about Donald Trump is that he is an incredible, intuitive politician. And when I was out on the campaign trail at these stadium events, when you experience them through the medium of cable television, often the focus was on violence in the crowds and were there racists there or bikers and all these kind of things. What I saw at these events was somebody who brought to mind almost one of these great American rhetoricians of the 1890s, you know, William Jennings Bryan, or somebody who would go out there day after day after day, and you could see him testing things out and seeing what resonated with the audience. And I tell the story in the book of how the wall came to be, and it was an idea that was given to him by some of his advisors that Trump initially wasn't too interested in, but he tried it out in an Iowa event.
I think they might know who that advisor is.
It is Sam Nunberg. Has anybody heard of Sam Nunberg? He's suddenly very famous.
He's done very well, hasn't he? Yeah.
He's kept himself out of jail.
He's on quite a press tour.
On quite a press tour indeed. So Sam came up with this idea for the wall, and Trump was initially kind of cool to it, but he tried it out in an Iowa event, and it brought down the house, and Trump could see that, and he began to riff on it. I'm going to build a wall, and I'm going to make Mexico pay for it, and it became a bigger hit. You know, I'm going to build a wall. Nobody builds like Trump. And so you'd see at these stadiums him testing out these different lines and seeing what worked and what didn't. And I think it forged a connection that a lot of us didn't appreciate in real time. And it put, you know, an issue set, forefronting illegal immigration and crime and things that weren't really on the radar of a lot of mainstream political people in Washington. And to me, that was really Trump's gift as a campaigner. And you can see him trying and struggling to continue this while he's in the White House. He doesn't have that visceral connection to a stadium audience like he once did. So I think he's having a little bit more trouble with it. But when he talks about Colin Kaepernick and NFL players kneeling, and now his new thing seems to be trying to push the death penalty for drug dealers, it's that same kind of like, what is going to make the crowd roar? And I think that remains one of his talents, and sometimes a scary one.
Mm-hmm. Joshua Green, you also attracted the attention of the president on Twitter.
I did. The funny thing, my book just came out in paperback, and the publisher decided, you know, we're going to use this Trump tweet, you know, referencing you or subtweeting you, whatever your book is, a blurb, and I thought, well, sure, why not? And then I got the book and I opened it up, and it's an actual picture of the tweet with all the retweets. They've sort of reprinted, and it seems appropriate because that's really Trump's medium for anything is Twitter.
Well, he's reviewing books in 140 characters, or
he's a critic. That's
a
big reader, I'm sure.
And
I was actually told by somebody in the White House after the book came out and it caused a little trouble. You know, Trump hasn't read your book, but he did look at the cover and he saw that Steve Bannon got equal billing, and he's angry about that.
Yeah. Kind of went deeper into your book than some.
Well,
you bet you should remind the crowd of the kind words that he had for you.
What? I don't remember.
I did it all, not
the rough criticism of the tweet was, you know, this guy's writing about all the geniuses that helped me in my campaign. I'm the only genius, you know, sad or something.
Exactly.
I don't know, whatever it was.
Ladies and gentlemen, Joshua Green, Rebels Bargain.
Thank you.
David Cay Johnston. Hello, my friend. You'll note that this panel is called The Making of Trump or something like that. You know, it's obviously a variation on Teddy White's great books, The Making of the President and stuff like that, or on David Cay Johnston's book, The Making of Trump. David's got a couple books that are in play right now. I know how much they're in play because last week I was in Germany, and I was in a train station in Hamburg, and they had a couple of Trump books, but the one on top, way on display, David, was Making of Trump in German. So you're nailing it worldwide. His new book is...
It's the one that says in German on the cover, "A Dictator in Waiting."
Yeah. Not that David's a critic. And you wouldn't think that from his the title of his new book, which is "It's Even Worse Than You Think." David... saved you for last because in this initial portion here, because you are the guy who's known Trump the longest. What's the one thing you want to make sure that these people take away? First off, he's not complicated. He's an instinctual politician. David Cay Johnston?
Well, first of all, everything that Katie and Josh said.
Good.
I absolutely, completely agree. I think that the most important thing beyond those 2 points that people need to understand, and I do not understand why this has never appeared in the New York Times, the LA Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal. Has been on MSNBC and CNN because I've said it on those places, but not on PBS, ABC, or NBC. However, if you lived in Germany, you would know this because it's been on TV there. In fact, 12 foreign television news crews have come to my home in Rochester, New York, and interviewed me about this. All throughout the 1980s, Donald Trump was very deeply entangled with a major international cocaine trafficker. He did favors for this man. He wrote a letter saying he was a stand-up guy and a credit to the community. His case was mysteriously transferred from Ohio to the New Jersey federal courtroom of Judge Marianne Trump Berry. And while she recused herself, the mules in the drug trafficking served up to 20 years, this guy 18 months. And everything Donald Trump did makes absolutely no sense as a casino owner who should have lost his license for what he did, but it makes perfect sense if they were both in the drug business together. And why this is not major news is to me absolutely astonishing to this day. Donald Trump's criminal entanglements, and they go back in his family 3 generations, to his draft-dodging pimp grandfather. Why this is not major news, I don't know. I mean, the idea that we would have someone with Donald Trump's criminal background, a man who's been twice tried for income tax fraud and lost both cases, civil trials, confessed to sales tax fraud. The most important thing to take away is to understand that Donald Trump is not just the greatest con artist in history, but he is one of the most successful criminals in the United States. And here he is, the head of our government. What does that tell us about us?
Wow, David Cay Johnston. You know, David, when you're talking like that, it makes me think it's even worse than you think. Okay.
You know why we have that title?
Yeah,
because the book is about our government. It's not about the White House. It's not about him personally.
And you know what? That's why I love you, because I am, in fact, a structuralist, and I think there's a lot more going on here than just one guy. But let me follow up with David on one thing. Now that we've got our basics down, right? Not complicated, instinctual politician, crook. All right. You've known, David, you've known Trump.
30 years come June.
Yeah. And do you think when you call him Donald on TV that annoys him?
Oh, I know. It absolutely annoys him, I assure you.
Because you do that if you went on Katie's show, you'd be going, yeah, Donald does this. Yeah.
On the other hand, you know, I was on a platform 11 months ago in San Francisco with Nancy Pelosi. You know what I called her?
Nancy?
Nancy.
Yeah. So you're
I call the senators their first names a lot, and I find out later that that's not appropriate from their press people.
Well, here's what I think about that.
It's interesting. Yeah.
Senators, representatives, and the president, as well as the Supreme Court, we're their bosses. They're our subordinates. We have temporarily imbued them with power, but they work for us. We don't work for them.
David, I'm following up with you just a little bit more here. You've known him for a very, very long time. Were you surprised when he ran for president of the United States?
No, Donald's been talking publicly since 1985 about running for president. Donald really believes not only he should be president, but he should run the whole world because he is genetically superior to the rest of us, as he and one of his sons have both said. And Donald literally believes that, you know, he's entitled here to all this. And on the day that he announced in 2015, I sat there watching this live on TV and said, oh my God, he might pull this off. And I started writing pieces, about 24 of them, to journalists saying, ask these questions. And one of them was 21 questions for Donald Trump. And nobody did except Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio.
Yeah. Speaking of Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio, I believe that the term Little Marco was actually tested out again initially on Katie Tur. Because you were Little Katie, right? He used to call you that from.
Yeah, it was Little Katie now, Little Marco, Little Bob Corker, Little Kim Jong-un.
Yeah, the little thing is a big one for him.
Little Adam Schiff.
Yeah, yeah, but that isn't really what I want to ask you. You have said, coming off what David just said, that Donald Trump. I hope I get it right. It's that he doesn't. He may surprise you sometimes, but it doesn't shock you.
Yeah.
You were not shocked when he became president.
No, and I mean, I kind of just want this whole panel to, I want David to talk the whole time and tell me everything and more you know about Donald Trump.
It's a lot of stuff.
No, and I think, David, I think you'd agree with this. He is not shocking if you follow him. I mean, nothing he does is out of character.
Right.
Nothing at all.
No, he's I guess one of the few good things you can say about Donald Trump is that he's consistent, and you know that everything at the end of the day is about Donald.
Yeah. No, but it's true. I mean, my button is bigger than yours tweet, which is so childish and scary, frankly, because you're talking about nuclear weapons. That's not shocking. It's surprising still that we have somebody in government who speaks like that and who takes to Twitter for his every whim. But what Donald Trump has done is not shocking, and all you have to do is go back and look at the way he's comported himself over the years. Look at the way he comported himself during the election. He would bury one controversy with another controversy. He didn't like that headline. He would say something even more outrageous. If Hillary Clinton was, dare she getting a day of press coverage, and he was not, he would come out and say something. I'll give you two examples. One was President Obama gave a speech on foreign policy and the fight against terrorism right after Bakersfield happened. And that was a Sunday night, Monday morning, Monday afternoon, early afternoon. Everybody's talking about the Obama speech. I have one of those rare days where I can go get lunch. It's December 7th, 2015, and if that date rings a bell, you'll remember it's not just Pearl Harbor Day. It's the day Donald Trump announced that he wanted a Muslim ban.
Yep.
So suddenly the news coverage, which had been all about President Obama, was now all about Donald Trump. He succeeded in pulling it back towards him. One of the other examples that looms large in my mind is the middle of the summer in 2016 during the Democratic National Convention. Usually, the other candidate who's not having their convention takes a few days off and lets that candidate have their couple days and plans on a strategy for the general election. It's just kind of tradition. It's the way you did things.
At that point, you should have known that Donald Trump
Yeah, you knew he was going to come out. So he has a press conference on July 27, 2016. And this is in the middle of the DNC. Hillary Clinton's getting all the attention. And he goes up and he says, Russia, if you're listening, I'd love to see those emails. So the news cycle was pulled back in his direction once more. He doesn't like being out of the news for a few days, for a few hours. So he'll go quiet on Twitter for a day or 2 days, 3 days. Maybe he'll be calm. But inevitably, when he sits himself in front of a television and doesn't have a full schedule or even a moderately full schedule and is golfing or has an excessive amount of executive time, he will start shooting his mouth off because his opinions, he is all id. He cannot stop himself. He's like a 7-year-old that's having a temper tantrum. He needs to be heard. He needs you to pay attention to him. It doesn't matter if it's bad attention or good attention. He wants you to be focusing on him at all times. What was the original question?
That was it. No, that was essentially, I mean, look, we were talking about a whole bunch of other stuff, but I like where you went there.
Sorry.
I'm keeping
Tangent.
that, but I am bringing Josh in here, because Josh, what we've gotten from David and from Katie here is an image of a guy who is, kind of wholly formed within himself, right? It comes into his head and it's nationwide. One of the things I love about your book, though, is that I think you establish very well in your book, because of your extraordinary access to Steve Bannon, who also is a guy who has pretty big ego. But that it appears that at some point in this campaign, Trump did need something more than himself. He needed a strategist who at the very least had some ideas. And what you bring into this is all of what these folks are saying, but also this other element of this remarkable individual, remarkable maybe in the small r, not the capital R. Talk to us a little about that.
Well, I think, I argue in the book that that Trump wouldn't be president had Steve Bannon not connected with him. And I make that argument for two reasons. One is that if you look at Trump and what he has talked about since 1985 and what he believes in, you hear a lot of the same notes struck that were being ripped off in foreign trade deals. Back in the 80s it was Japan, now it's China. He'll make better deals. The one element that I think Bannon brought in when he first met Trump in 2011 and began informally advising him, was the issue of illegal immigration. Trump just didn't talk about this and wasn't interested in this. If you go back and look at the things he tweeted about in 2011, 2012, not that any of you would spend your time that way, but if you did, you would see that there aren't these kind of tweets. And the beginning in 2013, when Bannon really stepped up and began advising him regularly, and when Trump, in hindsight, it's clear, became serious about running for president, you see this issue emerge, and it was so powerful in the Republican presidential primary. If you remember his announcement, he comes down the elevator in Trump Tower with all the pink marble around him. The first thing he does is call Mexicans rapists, and it became this, bumper to bumper notorious headline that I think announced from the get-go, A, that Trump was going to be a candidate unlike any other, but B, that he was going to put this issue in the forefront of his campaign. And this happened in part because Bannon was egging him on and spurring him along. And as soon as that happened, there were all these statements condemning him. John McCain came out and condemned him, and Paul Ryan said it was ugly and disgusting. And rather than back away or try and make amends, Trump doubled down, and Bannon arranged for him to travel down to the Mexican border at Laredo, Mexico. It was really the first media trip with campaign embeds and everything. Were you on that?
I was.
You were. To go down to the Mexican border and, as Bannon put it to me, say to Mexico's face what Trump had just said on the escalator after he came down. So I think that was very important. The other thing that Bannon brought to him, I think, is that Bannon had spent years and years studying how to tear down Hillary Clinton. He was the mastermind of this book, Clinton Cash, that had come out just as Clinton was announcing her presidential campaign. It had tarnished and impugned her reputation by connecting her and her foundation to some shady characters.
Into some of it.
There was a front page story in the New York Times. I mean, Bannon is a very clever guy when it comes to media and propaganda, studies the old Nazi and Soviet propaganda filmmakers. And I think what Bannon brought to him at this key moment after the Republican convention, when Trump was down about 8 or 10 points in the polls, was he was able to come in and take over the campaign and focus Trump on a target. And one of Trump's talents is tearing people apart when he can keep his attention trained on one person. Bannon, by virtue of the fact that he'd spent years studying how to attack Hillary Clinton, actually had ideas to arm Trump with. And when Trump gets warmed up on attacking somebody, as we've all seen, he can be very effective in doing that. And so I think
doesn't like to be handled, though, so he had to walk up quite a tightrope.
He does, and what people don't get about Bannon, I think, from the public image, is that he's actually a guy who's very smart and has a lot of personal charisma, but also had been an investment banker and a movie finance guy, so he had a lot of experience manipulating the egos of brash, ambitious, rich men, and I think was able to maneuver Trump in a way that didn't feel to Trump as if he were being maneuvered to keep him trained on Hillary Clinton, in a way that we saw work. I mean, across the entire fall, the polls were just closing. Maybe if you're smarter than I am, you could imagine Trump winning before election night. I never believed that he was going to until the end, but in the end, that was enough to get Trump elected. And if you subtract Bannon from that equation, I'm skeptical that it happened.
Well, the enthusiasm for Hillary Clinton wasn't there. And what we were seeing on the campaign trail was in a state like Arizona, this complete and utter devotion to Donald Trump. It didn't really matter what he was saying. They weren't watching the news to be convinced that he wasn't fit for office. If they were watching the news or reading the paper and seeing an opinion that they did not agree with, or seeing me or anyone else be critical of what he was doing, it only dug them in further. I mean, they felt like Donald Trump was fighting for them and Donald Trump was being attacked. And while he was being attacked, they were being attacked. He was warding it off for the rest of them.
Right on the button.
But then another thing that helped in the end of the campaign, not just Bannon, and what Bannon certainly helped Donald Trump focus on, you can't calculate how much WikiLeaks helped him.
Yeah.
October 7th, the day the Access Hollywood tape came out, that's the first day that the John Podesta emails came out. And that was hours after the Access Hollywood tape, just when Donald Trump could use it the most. And those Podesta emails came out every single day after that for 1 month until November 7th, until the day before Donald Trump was elected president. We haven't seen a new email since. it's coincidental or it's suspicious, but there's definitely something to be said there about Bannon coming in, that WikiLeaks popping up, and Donald Trump finding a way to overcome some very big and very damaging scandals.
Yeah, and it all echoed the same theme, too. I mean, all of this was trained against Hillary Clinton. The
Absolutely.
WikiLeaks, the Bannon attacks. You know, and the other point I'd make, I mean, Trump is so good at dominating media, but the other thing I think we ought to appreciate is that he was also good, and Bannon was good at using it defensively. And if you look at what happened after the Access Hollywood tape came out, that was the one time when Trump had taken over the airwaves in a way that I don't think he wanted to, and they were desperate to get something off there. And so lo and behold, you know, Bannon marches out these ex-Clinton accusers, which was something he told me years ago, you know, he wanted to introduce into the race, which I thought was cockamamie and silly. And then sure enough, you know, you go from having this bumper-to-bumper story about Trump and the Access Hollywood tape to, oh, now, you know,
Juanita
new
Broderick
footage we're
is
going to run
there, yeah.
Well,
on
if-
these on these
And if I can, on Katie's point about how voters reacted, you know, we've known since V.O. Key's writings more than a half century ago that Americans, first of all, tend to vote their pocketbooks, and secondly, they vote emotionally. The ideals of the Enlightenment that the framers had have not turned out to be nearly as important as the ability to manipulate emotions with slogans and advertising. And you know, in this country in 2012, 90% of Americans had a smaller income than in 1967, the year I finished high school. And Donald exploited exactly this, that the 90% of Americans have been forgotten. And I know because of conversations he had with other people that his economic policy, not his racial policy and racial animus, but his economic policy came out of a trilogy of best-selling books that I wrote, Perfectly Legal, Free Lunch, and The Fine Print. Now, Donald didn't read those, but he watched me talk about them on television and distilled out of them the message, you know, drain the swamp, your lunch is being eaten by Goldman Sachs, et cetera, all come right out of my books. Of course, as soon as Donald got into the White House, he turned Washington into a federally protected paradise for swamp monsters.
So, David, I want to come back to you on one thing there, but before we get, sorry, I want to keep on Josh for one quick question. I was just in Europe the other day, and Bannon was there. And he was cheering on the rise of the right in Italy, and he was talking to right-wing players in other countries. And you were just mentioning studies Nazi propaganda. I know he reads books by some pretty nefarious characters. Where's he coming from? Is he a fascist? Is he a nationalist? Is he? I mean, you talked to him or have talked to him. What's your take? And I only asked that to get Ben back into Trump.
He would describe himself as an economic nationalist, emphatically not an ethno-nationalist or a white supremacist. You know, the way he explains it, you know, he reads these Nazi philosophers and fascist philosophers because if you care about nationalism, he told me, you know, that was kind of the heyday of nationalist philosophy, and you know, you can draw strength and power from these ideas. Yeah, and Bannon, who before he went to Trump, had fancied himself a filmmaker. If you look at his movies, which I'm not really a fan of, but if you look at these are homages to propaganda films from the 40s, from the 30s and 40s. I mean, what he's really interested in is manipulating public opinion.
Can I ask you a question on that? Does he acknowledge that in order for that economic nationalism to thrive, it has to be paired with a certain amount of racism and hate for the other? This is who is the cause of your problems?
No, he won't acknowledge it. What he says is that, look, you know, I'm leading, or at the time he thought he was leading, a pitchfork wielding, rabble rousing army of all the people shut out from the establishments of both parties. That essentially, you know, you can't be too picky about who your allies are. We need to overrun the fortress.
Is there any acknowledgement that it's mostly disaffected white voters and not, and in the writings of Breitbart, it does target. It does target minorities. It does target women. I mean, he may not acknowledge it, but all of that is also paired with a certain xenophobia.
Yeah, well, so I asked him this for the book, and the furthest he'll go is he'll say, well, look, you know, yes, this is an element of our coalition, and I don't like that, but once our ideas prevail, that part of the coalition will wash away. That was a phrase. It'll just
as they did in
away,
Alabama.
And you're right. And
As they did in Nazi Germany.
And once
That didn't happen quickly.
You know, and once people see the benefit of these ideas, and Bannon's argument is that they'll help, you know, unemployment in inner cities, and that blacks and Latinos will, you know, awaken to, you know, the greatness of nationalism and Trump. I think that's his way of essentially avoiding the question or not confronting it head on. But certainly, if you look at just the people who are attracted by his writing, by his ideas, and into the Trump coalition, people that Bannon specifically brought in by using things like social media and Reddit and 4chan and all the kind of ugly internet backwaters that kind of emerged to support Trump and attack journalists during the campaign. A lot of that is Bannon's doing. So certainly he is conscious of what he's doing on some level.
He's willing to walk that line.
Even if he won't admit, you know, straight up, this is what I'm up to.
Let me get two things here. Number one, folks have got questions. We, in a couple minutes, are going to open questions. If you want to stray toward microphones, we will be taking your questions soon. But I want to take these folks, I like how you did that, mister, that low-level microphone move. But before we go there, I want to go back to David here for a second. And you know, one of the things that we've come through, that's sort of come through real big on this panel is Donald Trump and the people he will take counsel from really like propaganda. They really like to manipulate the media. They really like to own the storyline.
Right.
Did the media screw up?
Oh, big time.
All right,
Big
let's
time.
start with David, and then we'll work our way back over
So,
here.
well,
But before we, let me just follow. Did the media screw up? And is it bigger than Trump?
yes.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. So, first of all, understand that Donald Trump is a pioneer of fake news. In my previous book, The Making of Donald Trump, I tell about how he got national news coverage about his imaginary lovers. That's what we call the chapter. Kim Basinger, Madonna, and Carla Bruni, later the First Lady of France. And this was national news. I mean, it was just made up, but he got it. And what Donald would do is he would call up reporters, especially at Rupert Murdoch's New York Post, who don't care nearly so much about facts as about getting a big play for their stories. And once he got them in the New York Post, he would then get them onto TV. And they were just made up nonsense, like his claim that he's worth more than $10 billion. How many of you have read that his actual financial statement after he became president is just 1.4? And even that's grossly inflated, and I've shown why at dcreport.org, which is the nonprofit free news service I run. I hope you all sign up for, dcreport.org. So Donald has always sought out journalists who will repeat his BS. And he's figured out who those people are. And if you're like me or the late Wayne Barrett, what Donald would do, or Tim O'Brien, is attack you constantly. He came to both the Philadelphia Inquirer and the New York Times with teams of lawyers demanding that I be fired, which didn't get him anywhere, but raised the awareness of editors that they were going to hear noise about anything written that didn't follow the made-up Trump line.
And you protected yourself by getting a Pulitzer Prize.
Well, I think I protected myself by sticking to
By being good
facts.
at what
He's
you
never
did.
been able to show there isn't a fact. I mean, listen, Donald, I just called you a criminal. If you think you're not, I invite you to sue me.
Go ahead.
But what happened in the campaign is that Donald ran such a fascinating campaign. This was, we all rubberneck, right? Come on, be honest. We all rubberneck on the freeway, right? Well, this was an accident on the side of the road that came with dancing girls, a marching band, and fireworks. And Hillary Clinton puts up this Maginot Line. Trump just runs around the other side of it, and she keeps saying he can't pass the Maginot Line. And the news media screw-up was not asking the important questions. This is not new to this campaign. In the Mondale Reagan race in '84, if I'd gotten to ask one of the questions, it would have been, gentlemen, we're all fathers. You each have 5 children. At the time I had 6. So I would like you to please tell us very briefly about your last meeting with your grandchildren. Mr. Mondale first. Well, Mondale was quite the family man.
Yeah.
Went home from the Senate every night to have dinner with his children. Ronald Reagan hadn't met any of his grandchildren at that point. People didn't know that, and that would have been the purpose. And I can also imagine all the hell I would have taken for just asking the question. And during this campaign, nobody asked Donald the most obvious question. You've been talking about running for president since 1985. Presumably, you have studied the job description. It's only about 450 words long. Would you kindly tell us with specificity where the job description is written down? And would you please tell us the duties, powers, and limits of the presidency? It would have just destroyed him, and your time signal is up over there.
Yeah, I know.
We failed in the press. We didn't scrub Donald. You know, you can read in the New York Times and elsewhere the playmates of Barack Obama in Indonesia, the boys he smoked dope with in high school. You can read about George W. Bush's failure as a tax shelter salesman in Midland and his success getting public subsidies to start the Rangers baseball team, the source of most of his fortune. But you will not read a scrubbing of Donald Trump anywhere except in my books.
With all due respect, I'm going to disagree with you.
Okay.
I'm going to bring you in a second. Let me bring...
And it's very tough on the campaign to do this.
And I would say that the history of Donald Trump is out there. I mean, Jimmy Breslin wrote about just what you're saying. He would call reporters and create, in his words, a razzle-dazzle, Breslin's words. And he would convince reporters to follow his storylines for years when he was a favorite of the tabloids in New York, absolutely. But he has also gotten extraordinarily critical coverage from marquee newspapers like the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal.
Let me tell you where I disagreed about that,
Hold on, let me finish my
Let
point.
Katie finish, then we'll bring it back.
I think that the idea that Donald Trump wasn't scrubbed and that people weren't looking at him with clear eyes during the election is false. You guys knew who he was. Raise your hand in here if you didn't know who Donald Trump was on November 8th, 2016.
Well, let me ask
you did, because, hold on, because he was covered critically. He was also covered not critically. There was a big mix, but to say that the media, which is a very broad spectrum of reporters, from print reporters who do investigative work to Access Hollywood reporters to bloggers, I mean, you have to be very specific in who did not do a good job and who did a good job. I think it's not unfair to say everybody failed. I think we can learn certain lessons from the way we covered this campaign and covering future campaigns. I think the biggest lesson, more than any other, is not the scrubbing of Donald Trump, because again, we were all aware of who Donald Trump was. It is the lack of coverage of the American voter and what people cared about and what people were worried about and what was happening in communities across this country. That right there is where the media failed more than any other.
So, Katie, I thoroughly agree with you that we weren't reporting about what I call the vast majority, the 90%, which I've spent 25 years documenting how government has been picking their pockets. But let me ask a different question. How many of you knew before this talk today that Donald Trump spent years deeply entangled with a major international drug trafficker? A handful of people. How many of you knew without reading anything I wrote? Yeah. I mean, the New York Times, and I love the New York Times. I was very proud to have worked there, but the New York Times had the words Trump and Mafia in exactly 4 articles in the 16 months leading up to the campaign, and they were all references in passing. There was no, the heavy lifting in these things doesn't get done by TV or radio, it gets done by the major newspapers. And these things were not scrubbed. Nobody called me. I offered every journalist around access to my thousands and thousands of pages of Trump material. Foreign newspapers called me and wrote stories about things like the drug trafficker and other criminals that Trump was involved with. PBS specifically edited out my references to Trump and crime. The 3 broadcast networks did not have it on. MSNBC absolutely did and never hesitated about it. Likewise, CNN, though not as often. But the big papers never wrote a scrub of him, and you can go back and look at the New York Times and Washington Post coverage, and you will not see a systematic scrub of the kind we used to do.
Thank you, David. Let me draw a circle around this conversation and say that I think you've brought a lot of important stuff in here. And I think one of the challenges is that we have a media system in this country within which we have tremendous media, tremendous journalists doing incredible investigative work. I think the broader question, which I'm going to throw to Joshua, is has our media system developed to a point, though, where the good work isn't sufficiently highlighted, and the Bannon-Trump ability to create that sort of constant theater is able to wash over journalism?
I would come at it a little bit differently. I don't think that the media, especially cable news, was equipped to handle a candidate like Donald Trump. I mean, he was so far outside the norm. This idea, I think Katie talked about earlier, about every day, if he didn't like the headline, he'd throw out a news scandal. I mean, it felt as if you were a gerbil on a wheel, constantly chasing after these things without being able to have the time to delve deeply into these stories to the level that David would want us to, or that other people would want us to, because you can't just say, you know what, I'm going to ignore today's outrage because I'm not done focusing on yesterday's outrage. And that's a style that's continued on into his presidency, where, you know, sometimes I don't know whether I should write today about Bob Mueller's investigation or the porn star and her lawyer or what. And there are stories.
Russia, we have a long list
there
of
are
things
stories
that
that conceivably could end a presidency or would have ended an earlier presidency that are like in the B or C block on the evening news.
And
they don't even
or not there at all.
Or not there at all.
And let me stick with you on this, Joshua, just for 1 sec. And that is it now? Do we have a? Should we pause and say we have a media system that's not capable? Not that it's incompetent, not that it's irresponsible, not capable of keeping up with this. And is this something bigger than Trump? Is this are we moving into an era where we may have more of this, or is this a Trump phenomenon?
You know, it's a good question. I mean, two things have kind of risen up in tandem: Trump and his ability to kind of like shoot chaff to you know, distract us all from whatever the stories are. But then of course you have the rise of Fox News and this whole kind of alternate universe where there isn't even agreement on what objective facts are about Trump or a particular scandal. And you know, that makes it even harder for there to be a kind of unifying national media storyline around Bob Mueller's investigation, or Russia, or Stormy Daniels, or anything else. And that's leaving aside Trump's ability to kind of manipulate the media by kicking up a news storm, you know, announce a summit with Kim Jong-un and maybe people will stop talking about this, or announce steel tariffs and maybe people will forget that my staff secretary allegedly, you know, abused his ex-wives. I mean, there's just so much going on. It's hard for the media to hone in on the serious good work that is getting done.
John, before you go to questions, I just want to make one point. It is not the job of reporters on the campaign trail to scrub the candidate. I tweeted at the time and told people in talks, nobody covering the campaign asked tougher questions than Katie Tour. I would fault a lot of reporters for asking softball questions, but not Katie. She got right up and asked the tough ones every time.
It was why he was mad at her, but it was also, the other thing was that when we watch your show even now, I see some shows that have a great deal of coherence on them. I did during the campaign, see wall-to-wall Trump speeches.
Yep.
And that can be an unsettling.
It was an uncomfortable mix where people were trying to figure out what to put on and what not to put on. David, I hope I didn't come off too strongly. I don't disagree with your points. I do think that it's hard for some of the real, not salacious, the real juicy stuff, the really dirty stuff to come up to the top in the day-to-day wall of controversy
right, and I don't expect
coverage.
the people covering the campaign to do this. This is the job of people like me.
Here's my last point. And social media has a lot to do with this because we live in this 24/7. You need more, now, new, constantly. And we are all on this hamster wheel. It's not just cable news. You guys are on this hamster wheel as well. It's incumbent upon not just us in the media, but it's incumbent upon everybody to decide what you want to pay attention to, what you think is important. You have the ability to choose what to read, to choose what to watch. You can reward with your eyes the journalism that you think is important. It's not just us. I mean, we can only do so much. Ultimately, it's everybody.
The man who's been on his knees the longest now rises to ask the greatest question you will ever hear.
Okay, no pressure. Remember when the phrase "anyone could be president" was inspirational? How do we get back to that? Thanks.
See, and I appreciate an audience that outdoes the panel. And I'm going to give one, who most desperately wants to give a response to that? David, you do.
Well, I'm certainly not qualified to be president, and you know, I really wish we would get to a society where no, everyone can't be president. We expect you to be educated, to learn, to have sound judgment. not to be a great showman.
Well, and if I might do a moderator's interjection too. When I covered the campaign, all over the default answer to everything was that he was a good businessman.
Nonsense.
I know you say it's nonsense, but what I'm telling you is I think we might want to also rethink whether that's a top qualification for being president. Sir, you were waiting for a little bit. Let's take your question.
Well, you've touched on a couple of things that I think are really important. One of the things I just wanted to get the panel's take on was, you've talked around a little bit, was Russia and where that stands and the impact. And
Very good.
I can tell you where my latest reporting on Russia stands, and hopefully these guys can flesh it out a little bit. The investigation, the Mueller part of it, I presume. We don't know where the investigation stands because that office does not leak, period. What we get are drips and drabs from lawyers or from people with direct knowledge or from witnesses who have been interviewed. And in the most recent round of witnesses that have been interviewed, I think you know at least one, there's some certain lines of questioning that have come out, questioning that haven't just been to one witness but to a number of them. And that is having to do with that July 27th press conference that I just mentioned, where Donald Trump said, Russia, if you're listening. It has to also do with Roger Stone. What he may or may not have been involved in during the campaign. After all, he sent that prophetic tweet about a month before the Podesta emails came out saying it would soon be John Podesta's time in the barrel. So Mueller's asking what sort of relationship Stone had with Trump during the summer. Was he really not working for him any longer, or was there some sort of unofficial side business? And could that have been a back channel in some way to Assange or to somebody in Russia? They're looking at these things. There's also a number of threads on money laundering. You know the Gates and Manafort stuff well, I'm sure. There's this Seychelles Island meeting between Eric Prince and a Russian businessman close to Vladimir Putin that they're looking into as well. They're also looking into Michael Cohen and what sort of dealings he had been into with Donald Trump. If you talk to folks around Trump, they would call Cohen the fixer. Unclear what exactly he would fix, but we can get an idea that they're probably looking into that. They're looking into everything. I mean, it's just, we have no idea how far along they are in any one of those threads, or whether or not this is coming to a close sometime soon.
Katie,
there are.
Before I bring you in, David, let me ask Katie one question, and we'll do this very quickly because I want to get more questions. But Katie, you manage a show, right? You manage deciding what to put up. The Russia thing it's the stuff of novels. It is incredibly engaging. How do you where do we?
How do you balance it?
Yes, yeah.
We cover a lot of it. I mean,
I know you cover it, but what I'm saying is we could do it all the time.
We do it all the time. It's when there's a meaningful development in it, we try to cover it as much as we think is necessary for the day. But because we're covering that so much, it kind of feels like we miss a lot of stories that would otherwise be very big news and unfortunately are not educating you guys in everything that's going on. So it's a balance of, wow, this is something we've never seen before, and this could take a president down, and this is, was the president of the United States when he was a candidate working with a foreign government to take down a political opponent. That's a massive story. But while this is all happening, there's all sorts of systematic destruction to government bodies and the way agencies are run. That's getting, unfortunately, short shrift for
I wrote a great book about it.
You did.
Yeah.
Hey, you did.
Let me bring
there's
David,
a very
David.
deep. There,
David, I want to ask you a question.
It's a very rich
quick.
tapestry here, of which we're seeing a few of the more colorful threads. At DC Report, we've written a number of pieces about some of the very deep hidden threads about this. In one case, I think we ran 115 footnotes for credibility. And Donald has been involved with squirrely deals with Russian money going back to 1983. There's an enormous amount here. We're never going to see all of it, but there's a lot. This is a very rich tapestry.
That's my question for you. Is it the money that's going to get him, or is it the collusion, or we're talking about all
a prosecutor's job is to bring the case he can win, not the case you and I would like to see, or the perfect case. You bring the case you can win. And Mueller, who has put together, if Mueller and the 17 people he brought with him go out and decide to start a law firm, it'll knock every other white-collar law firm in America out of business.
They are focusing on white-collar crime.
Yeah, that's
so
what I mean.
money,
Yeah.
money,
It's the
money.
It's the money they're focusing on.
Josh
absolutely.
is desperately leaning toward the microphone. He's going to take less than a minute, and then this wonderful woman.
Well, and the one other guy who we know Mueller is asking about, who is in real need of money for his family's real estate empire, is Jared Kushner.
There you
I mean,
go.
that's the name that's come up again and again and again. Bloomberg, my employer, has done great reporting. I wasn't involved. I'm praising them. Great reporting on the $1.5 billion mortgage that Kushner is
comes due in January of 2019.
Very soon. And the effort to find sources of that money, I think, could also factor into Mueller's negotiation and bring together the issues, potentially, of money inclusion.
This woman
into the Eric Prince.
Oh, I'm sorry, what did you say?
Anyway,
back to Eric Prince?
No.
This woman is on. Bring that microphone into the range and ask us a great question.
This makes my head hurt. And I had to make a few notes after David spoke because I didn't realize about the mafia connection.
Get closer into that microphone.
I didn't realize that, first of all, my head hurts. I didn't realize until David said about the mafia and Trump, and it made me wonder about the journalists. And I don't blame all journalists, and I know you guys do a really good job, but a question that comes to my mind is, what would happen if the journalists, both print and television, could have an intervention that they would agree to and not broadcast or publish anything that Trump says or does for 1 to 3 days, and
He's
only
the president
focus-
of the United States. You can't do that. I'm sorry.
Not gonna
Well,
happen.
I think it would be a good idea. Focus on other aspects like the EPA.
I
and
love
those
what
other
you've brought in.
things.
I love what you've brought in here. This is important. I'll start with a quick moderator's intervention and just say the press should never get together and decide to do an intervention as a united front.
I was wondering if it would be collusion.
Yeah, well, the problem is the genius of the American experiment is that we have many voices, and they look at different things and they find different things, and that's good. So there should never be a united front intervention. And also, as Katie says, it is the President of the United States. You can't look away because in 24 hours, you have no idea what could happen. But let me just, for a quick hit from folks, we know that Trump does move the food dish out whenever he wants us to pay attention, and a lot of our media rushes to gobble it up. Are there quick lessons, quick things that we should ponder to try and avert that?
I think very much so. You got to keep your eye on the ball, the big stories. And I think there's been a lot of introspection in the national media in particular since Trump's election. And at least from my vantage point, the media has done a much better job at consistently staying focused on stories like the Russia investigation, like what Bob Mueller is doing, like some of the congressional investigations into this, and even this Stormy Daniels.
I don't want the Stormy Daniels thing to become too central.
Well, but it ought to be.
Here's
right?
my-
If
here's my-
the president is paying hush money to a
It's
porn
not
star, it
that-
absolutely
I know,
should.
I
It's not that he had
understand.
sex,
I
may have had
understand.
sex
Yeah,
with a
yeah,
porn
yeah,
star.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
like, can that porn star bribe the president of the United States because she was paid hush money?
But
That's
John,
the-
you-
But
John,
my point is that these
Josh,
stories
Reagan-
are staying consistently in the headlines in a way that even Trump is not able to knock out by tweeting crazy things.
Bring in David Cay Johnston
I
in for
agree
a
with
sec.
Josh that we need to think about what we decide to focus on. Trump this week, we reported, DC Report, has once again delayed a rule that causes 2 Americans a week to die. Delayed the rule. Why this isn't on the front page of every newspaper in the country, I don't know. But we need to focus on what he's doing, not what he's tweeting.
I think it's kind of a big deal. Yes. I think it's kind of a big deal what Scott Pruitt's doing over at EPA. For instance, this gentleman's got a question.
How responsible was Hillary Clinton for the election of Donald Trump?
Ooh, okay. Quick, we have a couple minutes here, so I'm going to let one person take a shot at that. I apologize, whoever's most excited.
Lots of baggage, didn't adapt her campaign to what he did.
I'll second that.
Yeah, you can. Go ahead.
You know, she had a Maginot Line, and he just went right around it.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was talking to somebody on her staff, her campaign the other day, and one of the hits they have on how they did things was that all of her ads were directed at him. All of her ads were trying to take him down, and none of them were about her and what she believed in and what she wanted to do. And she didn't go to Michigan.
Which is very relevant to the fall elections in this country. You know, I know what the Democrats are against. Please tell me economically what they're for.
And And it would have been great if there were a few ads aimed at rural America. This woman here's been waiting for a little bit. You are into the 1 minute zone, my friend.
1 minute. It keeps me up every night. What is the one or two things that you think are necessary to bring this fake president down?
A new Congress.
Okay,
You know, Max Boot, who's here, John.
Brothers, can I just ask you, brothers and sisters, if you don't applaud loudly right now, you can applaud really loud in about a minute, but I want to get a lot into this last minute. So
it isn't the media's job to bring the president down. I mean, we don't put a target on his back. What we do is report honestly to the best of our ability on what he's doing, what he's done, and if the byproduct of that is that he is impeached or indicted by Bob Mueller, that's fine. But we don't try and predetermine outcomes.
But the question is, what does it take to change this? And it takes a new Congress.
Congress would do that.
Or a talented special prosecutor.
Or a Democratic Party. If it was functioning a little more, and Republicans, by the way, who might...
It just takes voters.
Yeah. Very good.
It just takes voters.
Why is there no release of the visitors' logs to the White House?
Got it. Okay.
Because they don't want to release them.
Last question here from our folks.
You missed these two guys.
Oh, I got guys on the floor. Okay, we're going to do this really quick. C-SPAN's going to stick with us for a minute. Pop it up, mister. And I will fold it into the... Now, come on, pop up.
Okay.
Yeah.
I want your take on Mr. Kelly, his chief of staff. Is this an American patriot who is trying to protect the American public from Trump, or is this a gentleman who is all in with Trump? What do you think?
It's hard to get a read on Kelly. He first of all, visitors logs, whoever asked that.
Let's do that.
Just because they can. They decided they don't want to do it, and they're not feeling enough pressure to release them. That's just the short answer. The Kelly question, I think that's debatable. I think he came in with a certain reputation, and that reputation has eroded significantly since he's been in there. The attack on Frederica Wilson, number one, where it turned out what he was saying was not true, and there never was an apology or an amendment to that, took away some of his credibility. The Rob Porter stuff took away a lot of his credibility because he's now changed his story a number of times on when he knew about Rob Porter and what he did and how he reacted to it. That story is all over the map and very inconsistent. And that does make people question the values that he's bringing into the office and what he is able to do. Remember, Donald Trump is not somebody that's going to be controlled by anybody.
Under military law, what Kelly has done falls under the category of conduct unbecoming an officer, or CUBO.
Yeah. And Kelly is a product of a media dramatically failing to vet someone. Dramatically failing. He said and did things in his early tenure, particularly when he got into the cabinet, that showed an incredible subservience to Donald Trump. And when he came to chief of staff, and I had people saying all the time, oh, wow, he's going to get the White House in order? There was no evidence of that. It was terrible coverage. It goes to the problem of horrible coverage of the people that Trump has appointed to these positions. This man gets the last question.
Why does the media not come out tougher on Sarah Huckabee Sanders at her press conferences?
Okay. Great question, sir. Much appreciated. And we're going to give... I'm going to give one of you a shot at that, and then I'm going to give one last quick take, and we'll be out of here. Who wants to give us Sarah Huckabee's?
I come out of her press conferences every day. I think I'm pretty tough on her. When she's not telling the truth, we try to point it out. When she's to her face,
well, they do.
They're pretty tough on her. And also, you have to understand something. You don't want an angry, mean, loud "F you" press corps in the White House press briefing room. You want a certain amount of, no matter what the administration is doing, you want a certain amount of decorum and respect among the press in that room, because they are the ones that will be there
that you're
when they're
asking
gone.
The question shows that you're asking the question shows how tough they're being on her. They really are. Somebody's been doing this for more than 50 years. They are really being tough on her in that room, and at the same time appropriate.
She just spins.
Brothers and sisters, she spins. Brothers and sisters, let me leave you here with Katie Tur's interaction with Sean Spicer. To give you a little confidence in journalists here, Sean Spicer says, you guys have an NBC thing like it was some sort of criticism of, you know, one network picking on people. And Katy Tur said, yes, we do. It's called journalism. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a big round of applause for journalism, for Katy Tur, for Joshua Green, and for David Cay Johnston.
You got it. All right.
You're watching Book TV's live coverage of the 10th annual Tucson Book Festival. And in just a couple of minutes, David Cay Johnston, who was one of the panelists in the Gallagher Theater here at the University of Arizona, will be making his way to our set here at the Book Festival and taking your telephone calls. And welcome back to our set at the Tucson Festival of Books in this beautiful southwestern desert town where, I hate to tell you folks, it's 77 degrees, those of you sitting in colder climes. David Cay Johnston is our guest. He's been a fixture on C-SPAN over the years with his Pulitzer Prize winning reporting as an investigative journalist, and especially focusing on financial issues and tax reporting. So we've just heard your panel session. Earlier today, another panel session spent much of the time suggesting that this is a decades-long change in American society that Mr. Trump is a symbol of. You got into that at the end here, and it sounded more like you think he's a phenomenon.
No, no. In fact, at the end of my current book, It's Even Worse Than You Think, I point out that Donald Trump is a symptom. The disease is that we are allowing our democracy to atrophy. Voter participation rates. 100 million people could have voted in the 2016 elections and did not. People not paying attention. And there's a philosophy that I follow in the book and that my nonprofit news service, DC Report, singular, dcreport.org follows. It's our government. We own it. We should act like owners. When you outsource your government to other people, it's the people who make money off government who start running the government for you, and they're the ones who pick your pockets. I did a trilogy of books about that that C-SPAN had me on for, Perfectly Legal, Free Lunch, and The Fine Print, but all these rules and laws nobody knew about until I wrote about them on how Washington and the state capitals pick your pockets because people are not paying enough attention to the duties of citizenship. It's our government. We own it. Act like owners.
Last question, because your callers are all stacked up for you.
Yep.
This is a complex society with a lot of personality-driven entertainment and media. People are busy with their lives. How do you think we get to a society where people pay attention and act like owners?
Well, I think we have to start with our education system, which was created in the late 19th century and was designed to produce uncritical drones to work in industrial America. We're now moving into a very different economy where we need critical thinking skills and we need to update our education system. That's long term. In the short term, people need to recognize that your income, your safety, your children's welfare are tied up with government policies. And if you care about yourself and your family and your neighbors, then you need to say, I've got to put some time into really learning what's going on here.
Let's listen to Ellen in Tarzana, California. Ellen, you are on for Mr. Johnston. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I had an observation. during the book festival that the reason a lot of these stories were not getting out is that all the major networks are very litigious now, and they are not going to run a story that they think they're going to get sued over, particularly PBS. They don't have the budget for it. And I think this is one reason why reporters, I'm surprised that there are as many good reporters as are, because they can investigate till the cows come home and produce very good stories. Only a small amount or none will get on the major network once they pass the news director, who has probably been advised by the by the legal department. And I think this has had definitely an effect on what gets out to particularly after Dan Rather, CBS had to pay for that story. I think there's been a downward trend.
Thank you, Ellen. Your panel touched on that a bit.
We did. Well, first of all, PBS, there is a real problem because of congressional funding, and it has cowed them. When they interviewed me, they said anything I said about Trump and criminals and the mafia, they were going to not put on the air, and they didn't. The networks, I think, are a somewhat different story. The coverage since Donald Trump took the Oval Office has been, I think, in many ways very good and very aggressive. What we're not seeing enough coverage of is of the government, what is happening to our government. That's always a tough deal for TV because of the nature of how television works. Donald Trump certainly has tried to intimidate people. He's been threatening to sue me for 29 years. You know, if he thinks what I'm saying about him isn't true, I invite him to sue me. But I don't see the problem Ellen does so much of censorship because of litigation. I see it because of enormous pushback from people who see Donald Trump as a demigod, not a demagogue, but a demigod, and they don't want to hear anything critical about him. And at the end of the day, commercial TV is about advertising.
Next call's from John, and here in Tucson. John, welcome to the conversation. Go ahead.
Thank you. Mr. Johnston, I'm curious to know why no one mentions the fact that Eric Prince is commander of Knights of Malta. That's the key by beating the safety bills with the United Arab Emirates and the Russian. Knights of Malta in America. Thank you.
Okay. Well, you have a right to belong to any organization you want in this country. I mean, our Constitution protects your right of assembly, and implied in that is of association. But I think you're going to hear more about Mr. Prince in the near future because he's becoming more relevant to the Mueller investigation.
Would you also explain the cabinet connection with Eric Prince?
Well, Eric Prince is the younger brother of Betsy DeVos, the education secretary, who became secretary only because Mike Pence cast the deciding vote, and I think that's the only time we've ever had to have a vice president cast the deciding vote on confirmation of a candidate. It's the lowest vote count anybody's gotten in our history.
Next up is Zachary, Long Beach, California. Zachary, you're on for David Cay Johnston in Tucson.
Thank you for taking my call. First of all, what you said earlier, the masses to vote is so important. Shall we say it? But we can figure out what you say. My question on the panel is about the questions or the media ask the candidates to those without any background and think such as the president. The pertinent questions, executive power, limitations, filibuster. Do you think the journalists or in report, or is it because of the power about the executive power about them to provide direction? Thank you.
Well, Susan, I couldn't pick out Zachary's question because we're having technical difficulties.
Yeah, his question was about journalism and the quality of reporting.
Well, the reporting during the campaign, I think, was just indefensibly god-awful, and I've spoken out about it in a number of forums. There was a failure to scrub the candidate who's now president. I think the coverage since January 20th of 2017 of the White House has been absolutely superb, some of the best I've seen in my lifetime. The coverage of what's happening in our government, which is the focus of my book and of DC Report, still very, very lacking. And I'll give you a simple example of that. DC Report, we put up a story yesterday that the Trump administration has once again delayed a beryllium rule. 2 American workers die every week because we don't have this beryllium rule, and they keep delaying it. It's been delayed now since March of last year. And nobody else is reporting this. Certainly none of the mainstream news organizations are reporting it. So the coverage of the government, not so good. The coverage of the White House, fantastic.
Was there ever a point in which coverage of government was good?
It's been better in the past, but one of the reasons Brian Lamb created C-SPAN was exactly that we weren't talking enough about our government and too much about politics. But we used to have, yes, more coverage. There was a time when the Housing and Urban Development Department actually had a reporter covering it. There was a time when the IRS had a reporter covering it for the New York Times, me. And now state and the Defense Department, National Intelligence are sort of the only agencies that really have reporters. There hasn't been a beat reporter at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission in years, even though its actions affect your pocketbook every single month.
Next up is Bob in Overland Park, Kansas. Bob, you are on. Welcome.
Hi, I want to thank David for his great as an investigative reporter and how he has shed light on many. My question, and you alluded to this previously, is the role of media and basically the conflict of interest that media has in terms of money, campaign ads, how that compromise the partial and non-biased. The other thing that I thought that might be useful is to have C-SPAN and PBS host a presidential debate because they might be able to avoid that conflict. And
yeah, I'm going to, Bob, I'm so sorry. I'm going to interrupt you. And as you could see, David Johnston and I are having difficulty with getting the connection here, and I apologize for that. We were told by the producer he wanted to know about the debates. So go back to the campaign and the way those debates were structured and how they ended up affecting the process.
And I'm sorry we're having the technical difficulties. I think we need to completely blow up the way we do the debates. We have television personalities asking the questions. I would rather see the two candidates duke it out with one another, and I'd like to see serious print journalists or online journalists asking questions. And I'll give you two examples. If I had been one of the people questioning Donald Trump, I would have said, Donald, you've been talking about running for president since 1985. Presumably you have read and even studied the job description. With specificity, where is it written down and what are the duties, powers, and limits of the presidency? Donald could not have answered that question. I'm absolutely certain of it. Just as in the 1984 election, I would have asked Mondale and Reagan about family values and asked them to talk about the last time they had seen their grandchildren. Mondale was well known for going home from the Capitol to have dinner with his children at night. Ronald Reagan at that point had never met his grandchildren. And I think that would have been very revealing about the idea of family values. And we need to have much better questions asked. We get a bunch of softball questions lobbed at candidates, and that's just not the way to run debates.
Okay, we're going to try another one. Keep your fingers crossed. Okay. Ron in Ormond Beach, California. Ron, go ahead, please.
Hi, I was listening to a panel about a month after Trump was elected. The panel consisted of John Yoo, and he was chortling about how Trump knew everything about a building, you know, the particulars. Now, does Trump actually know about the particulars of constructing a building, or does he just slap his name up on the building?
Well, Ron, that's a real good question. First of all, people should know who John Yoo is. He's a law professor, I believe, at Bolt Hall at the University of California, who famously wrote memos supporting some of the, I would regard as worst policies of the Bush administration regarding detainees in the war on terror. Donald is appallingly ignorant. I once at lunch was going over one of his business deals with him, and I could see him getting more and more and more apprehensive, and suddenly he goes, "How do you know that?" And I said, "Well, because you put all of this in the public record and I studied it." And it was very clear that I knew his business deal better than he did. And Donald knows how to cut corners and save money, but he has no deep knowledge literally on anything. And there's plenty of his testimony under oath, things he's written, interviews he's given that document things. And my favorite example for you is Donald, I quote in my book, It's Even Worse Than You Think, as saying in shorthand, I'm the world's greatest expert of all time on taxes. All time. Nobody knows more about taxes than Donald Trump. Donald under oath was asked, what do you know about accounting? And he said, I don't know anything about accounting. Well, that would be the equivalent of me, and I am a well-known tax expert, saying I am the world's greatest airplane designer. What's a wing?
I wanted to talk to you about writing a book, since we're at the book festival, and your book is about a moving target. I mean, every day there is another story to cover, another aspect of the story, and a book is a snapshot in time. Yeah. So how does a book work for you as a journalist?
Well, this book in particular was a real serious problem. It covers the first 250 days, and I wish it could have covered the first 365 days. So what I did was set out to say, what are the things that we know that we can establish and that you don't know? That is, if I just tell you what's in the news, you're not going to want to read the book, and I'm not doing anything for you. And my job as the reporter is to, particularly as an investigative reporter, is to tell you things you would not know but for my work. So I focused on stuff that either was not in the news at all or was glancingly in the news to tell you these stories of what's going on inside our government. I read about a fellow who was a high-level interior official, an executive. Today he processes oil royalty checks because he won't quit. I tell about a woman named, if I recall correctly, Betsy Outlander. I'm sure I'm bollocking her name, at EPA, who she and her team were told to prepare detailed reports on every weakness in the Clean Water Act if they were to try and enforce it. And they turned all this over, and of course it is basically now a guide to how to avoid having the federal government enforce the Clean Water Act that Richard Nixon signed against you. And so to walk through what's going on inside our government, but I also had to look at the fact that there's a set deadline, and it's got to be discreet and clear to people, and it has to be useful even as events change in the future. It's not an easy trick, but that we came out first at #2 on the New York Times bestseller list and then ran out of books suggests that I did a reasonably good job at it.
Next up is Wendy here in Tucson. Hi, Wendy. Welcome.
Hi. So I just have a really quick question. I'm one that believes that the president is more of a figurehead. He basically is to look at, and I mean, he does have things to do with the government, don't get me wrong, but it's our Congress, our senators, they're the ones that actually push everything through. Am I wrong in thinking that we need to actually clean that up and maybe have limits on the time they're spending there instead of saying, I mean, don't get me wrong, Trump is an embarrassment, but don't we have to clean up other parts before we can get things clean that really need to be cleaned?
Well, Wendy, let me break that into two pieces, okay? And first let me deal with this particular president. Donald Trump is not actively engaged in many, many things that are going on. What happened is that Team Trump, the people he brought with him, have put into our government what I call political termites. And just like termites will eat away at the walls and the flooring in your house if you're not aware of them until one day you put your foot through the floor in the kitchen and discover you have a huge bill that's come due, Trump has put people whose names in many cases have never been in the news and whom I write about in my book, who are busily making the government ineffective. And remember that Steve Bannon calls himself a Leninist, meaning he believes that the existing order should be destroyed completely and replaced. Said that this administration would deconstruct the administrative state, which is a complex way of saying we're going to make the government ineffective. So there's a real problem there, but it's not Trump directing these things, it's the people who came with him. On the larger issue, yes, the framers of our Constitution intended that the executive was there to carry out the assignments essentially given by Congress. Now, Max Boot, a noted conservative Republican who's here at this conference, said a couple of weeks ago that he believes, as a former Republican, he resigned over Trump, that every Republican member of Congress who hasn't stood up to Trump needs to be voted out of office. And I certainly think we need a new Congress. We need a Congress that will, in fact, react to and will fulfill its constitutional duties under our system of checks and balances with regard to this president. I don't limit that to Republicans. I'm a registered Republican. But I do think that there's a real problem with our reelecting people. I don't like term limits. I think that people who are doing their job ought to stay in their job if they're doing it well, but voters need to stop this practice of saying, well, I really hate what Congress is doing, but I like my congressperson. You need to be as skeptical and as hard, flint-eyed about your own member of Congress and your own senators as you are of the institution. And a wholesale change, I think, would be a very good thing right now.
We have 30 seconds till we're finished here, and it's going to get loud again. But do you think you surprised a lot of people with your party registration just now?
Probably. I registered as a Republican because where I live, the only interesting elections, primaries, are with the Republicans. And after all, you know, the Democrats, you would never get the chance to vote for a presidential candidate who thinks that cinnamon buns cure diabetes.
Most journalists do not announce their party registration.
Well, I agree, but I was asked one day on television by Lou Dobbs when he was at CNN what my party registration was, and I said it. And a couple of editors at the New York Times, where I worked at the time, were unhappy about it, not because of the registration, but that was their attitude. And mine is, you know, you ask a question, I'll give you an honest answer.
The book is called It's Even Worse Than You Think, What the Trump Administration is Doing to America. David Cay Johnston, our guest here at the Tucson Festival of Books. Thank you for being with us.
Susan, thank you.
We're going to take you now back to the Gallagher Theater.